Why me, God? Why me, God? All right, let's say a word of prayer and we'll dive right into this. Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to come before you. We pray, Lord, that your spirit would be here, and especially for us to have our eyes open to a different perspective. Pray, Lord, that we would see you in a different light. Perhaps today we might be able to walk away knowing something a little bit different about you that we didn't know before. And by beholding, may we become changed. I pray in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, is that the actual time? It's not okay. All right. So this sermon is expected to go about an hour and a half, so I'm joking. All right, I just want to keep track of time. So let's dive right into this. Why me, God? This has kind of come up different times. Many people tend to ask this question. I've asked this question a lot. And especially it comes in times of tragedy. But also sometimes you add it in times of success. Some people aren't quite sure if they really deserve the success that they have, or some great event happens to them, a Titanic event happens, the ship goes down, and there were many survivors of the Titanic that just didn't believe that they were supposed to survive because so many of their relatives died. And so they sat there, and even though something good happened to them, they said, why me, God? Didn't feel like they deserved to live. On the other hand, of course, there were many individuals that went through tragedies, and they're like, well, man, like, I lost something. Financial hit took place. I lost my house. I'm out. My family rejected me. Why me, God? It's a question that's asked in different seasons of your life, when there's success, when there's also failures. It doesn't seem to matter. And one thing that we're going to look at today is the story of Joseph. How many of you are familiar with the story of Joseph? How many of you just didn't want to raise your hand? All right, that's okay. How many of you are not familiar with the story of Joseph? You just didn't want to raise your hand. All right, that's totally fine. So get this. If you are familiar with the story of Joseph, this is a good thing. However, you are likely going to be deeply challenged because you are familiar with the story of Joseph today, right? One of the big problems that we tend to have, and I'm going to get into this, is there's two giant problems that we tend to have. This is not just approaching the Bible, approaching God, but there are these two giant problems that we tend to have. And this kind of leads us to consistently asking the question, why me, God? Are you ready for them? Some of you might want to actually remember this and jot this down. We'll talk about it as we go through. But the whole purpose of this is to get into why this had to happen to Joseph. If you're familiar with the story, we'll get into the story of Joseph. But the first thing that I want you to realize is, number one, we're wired to ask individualistic questions. We are wired to ask individualistic questions. What does that mean? Why me, God? Right? Why has this happened to me? Why does this always have to happen to me? When am I going to reach my destination? When is that goal for me going to ever take place? Why does this issue always seem to pop up in my life, and why do their life seems to be so much better? There's a constant individualistic approach to asking the question. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. We ask individual questions all the time, like, who am I? Where am I going? What does God want me to do in life? We asked it about good things and bad things. Like, there's always questions that we need to know about ourselves. What is significant about me? What's my contribution to the world? Have you ever wanted these, or am I just crazy? All right, some of you are shaking your heads. So think about this for a second. We tend to be wired to ask individualized questions. Got it? Got it?
Got it.
Got it.
Where with you?
They're talking to me over here. Got it? Okay, all right. Just wanted to make sure. Because if you didn't get that point, you're going to miss me on the next point. And that's the first problem. We ask individualistic questions. The second problem is this. Here we go. God is not the God of individuals. He's the God of generations. I'm going to repeat that. God is not the God of individuals. He's the God of generations. Now, because of that fact, we tend to always consistently be out of step with God. we have expectations for God to do things in our life that are just always a bit off. And so what happens here is this. We come to a situation in our life, and I just kind of brought this up here. And maybe like a good way to illustrate this would be, Jim, could you help me out here? So just hold on to that end of the rope, right? Just come out. Just over there, just so it can stretch out a little bit. Okay. So everybody can see this rope. If you can, come up one step just so that they can see you. Everybody can basically see this rope, right? Now, one of the craziest things about this kind of rope, and when we're talking about having individualized questions, I want us to consider something. You see, when we have this distinctive rope, what ends up taking place is, I want you to think about this rope being generations. This is not just you. This is me. This is grandpa, great-grandfather, going back through Earth's history 4,000 years, right? Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, if this rope is the scene of 4,000 years worth of generations, where would you be on this rope?
Towards the end.
Towards the end. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So let's just randomly say that you're here. Actually, no. Let's just put it right here, just so we have a stable area. So right where the mic is, right? So you live out your life in that little beam of time right next to where the mic is, right? And the key thing is this. We have a lot of situations that we tend to go through in life, and that's fine. Different places we need God to do different things for us. And we get into struggles, and we need God to help us out, but here's the problem. We're like, God, why did my child have to die? God, what happened to me that my wife divorced me? God, like what's going on in my life that I can never seem to get ahead in the economy? I never seem to have enough. God, why does it always seem like I'm insufficient? Right? And so you have all these thoughts in your head, or why is it that my children don't seem to love me? And so you have these thoughts, and you're living out your life, and you're doing the best that you can. And you want God to make an adjustment, make a move, right? Now, the thing about it is, if God ends up making a move, let's say that the only thing that God needs to do to change your situation is to simply move the rope down a little bit, right? Remember, this is your life. If you're living at this level, something like God basically does some intervention. He's like, hey, you know what? Let me do some interventions in your life, and I'm just going to change your situation. Let's do that. All of a sudden, your kids love you again. You know, finances are up. Everything is working out for you, and you're doing really good. All God did was change your situation. What is the problem? There's a problem here. Because the entire rope is attached to each other. Changing your situation changes the entire generation. I don't know if some of you caught that. I'll say that again. So because your life is where that mic is, correct? And he specifically is going to do something in your life to change your situation, right? Mm-hmm. Right? Okay, all right. He's going to shift it, and when he shifts not just your situation, but your grandmother's. He shifts also your dad's. There's also something happening with your brother. There's something with that person that you don't even know that you're going to meet 3 years from now. And so what ends up taking place is when God makes a shift in your life, he shifts generations. Notice that he doesn't call himself the God of Abraham only. He says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Generations. He's not the God of individuals. Thank you, by the way. And so one of the key things that happens when we get into stories like this with Joseph is we tend to look at the story of Joseph and we're trying to look at his successes and his failures. And we're trying to ask the question, hey, why is it that in the story of Joseph, he has to get sold into slavery. Everything is looking up for Joseph. And all of a sudden, tragedy starts to take place. And Joseph ends up getting at odds with his brothers. His brothers dislike him because he's like the favorite child, and his father always chooses him. His father even made a coat of many colors and actually put it on him. I don't know if you guys know much about that coat anyway. One reason why the brothers were really pissed off, just so you know, because the brothers actually worked in the field, by the way, right? So when you put on coats and other stuff like that, you put on certain attire to go to the field. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so what ends up taking place is Joseph's coat of many colors. If you look at the background of this in the Bible, the coat of many colors isn't a working coat. Mm. Imagine if all of a sudden everybody's going out to the field to work and the father says, "Hey, Joseph, put on this suit." What does that tell you? He ain't going to the field. He's in charge of the field. The brothers were ticked off at that. People just think, oh, his coat was red and blue and yellow. No, it really wasn't that serious to them. The big issue was that it showed a sign of significance over them, and they were ticked off. Now let's dive into this thing. So what ends up taking place with Joseph is he's sold off into slavery, and these traders end up taking him all the way down to Egypt. In fact, the road that he would have taken to go to Egypt, he would have not been too far passing back right where his dad's camp was. So he likely would have seen the hills and the tents of where his dad actually was while he was being taken away. He couldn't scream, he couldn't yell, and no one can go get him. Devastating situation. Goes down to Egypt, ends up having about 13 years of issues back and forth. I'm kind of fast forwarding through the story to get to a certain pivotal point. But the point is, he ends up in prison, and he does a really good job in prison. He's a great administrator, and they essentially end up promoting him to be the head over the prison. And if you remember Joseph, he was very widely known for these dreams that he had. When he was a young person, he tended to have these dreams that he would tell to his father and also his brothers, of basically a situation where there's a pair of grains and also sun, moon, and stars. And basically what you end up having is there's situations where people just keep bowing down to Joseph in his dreams. That's the short end of the story. And so what they hear is like, wow, like you're having dreams about your father, your mother, and your brothers bowing down to you. Who do you think you are? And it would consistently frustrate and irritate individuals, but there was no meaning to it. Now he fast forwards in the story, he's in this prison. He still doesn't know what is the meaning of his dream in life, right? He has this dream that was given to him. There's no interpretation of it, and he's going through multiple trials, partly because he had dreams that were given from God. God just didn't explain it to him. So what we end up finding is that through a series of events, and you guys still are at Genesis chapter 41, correct? So through a series of events, what ends up taking place, he ends up telling the interpretation of a dream of a butler and a baker. A baker and a butler end up having a dream. The baker ends up dying. The Pharaoh ends up killing him, but the butler ends up getting restored after Joseph's interpretation. Joseph interpreted his dream and said, hey, the Pharaoh's going to restore you back. You're going to continue doing what you did and being the cupbearer to the Pharaoh. Everything's going to work out great for you in life. And so the guy got promoted back to his position and completely forgot about Joseph for 2 years. Pharaoh ends up having a dream. And this is kind of where we're going to kind of settle in here. Because Pharaoh has a dream. And he particularly is extremely bothered because the situations are strange. There's these fat cows. There's 7 fat cows. And all of a sudden they're consumed by these little small, like weird looking cows that have barely any meat on them. And he's just like, what's going on? Why are these like little scrawny cows eating up all the fat cows? What's happening in this dream? And he couldn't quite figure it out. Joseph comes down and says, oh, by the way, God is trying to basically tell you something. There's going to be 7 years of plenty in which the land is going to be very flourish. You're going to have everything that you want. Then there's going to be 7 years of actual famine, and it's going to eat up the entire land of everything. And so, therefore, the land will be devastated. Everybody's going to die. That's basically what's going to happen. And he told him a way to prevent all of this. Pharaoh's pleased with this, right? And he decides to promote Joseph to make sure he executes a plan to ensure Egypt survives. Here's the big thing I want to now jump into. When we look at the story of Joseph from an individual standpoint, we're going to start looking at, man, like Joseph's position is way down here, but he's about to get elevated. I'm going to show you the reason why an individualistic purpose and a generational purpose is extremely different. It's going to flip the entire story upside down. Let's go ahead and begin. Genesis chapter 41. Genesis chapter 41. For those of you that are going to be following along, it's going to be starting at verse 37. Genesis 41, and starting with verse 37. Now Pharaoh comes back, and this is the time where he's about to elevate Joseph. Pay attention to this very carefully. It says, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all the servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a man, one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Now, what's happening here so far?
Joseph is being elevated.
Say that again?
Joseph is being elevated.
Yes, Joseph is being elevated. Now, Pharaoh is giving him several things. He's like, listen, I'm going to set you over the entire land of Egypt, correct? All right. Pay attention to these verses very carefully. What happens here is we think that a good thing is happening. It's not. Something bad is happening in this picture. Here we go. Verse 42. It says, then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name. He gave him a new name, Zaphnath-Paneah. And he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. What a great story here. So what happens here is Joseph is actually very faithful to God. And through all of his faithfulness, now all of a sudden he's being elevated in the land of Egypt. Things are starting to happen for him. Now, in this scene, Pharaoh does several things for Joseph. What does he do? Yes. Yeah, you can just shout it out. What does he do?
And clothe them.
Yes, he clothes him. He clothes him with these royal garments. What else does he do?
He gave him power.
Say that again?
He gave him power.
Yes, he gave him power over all the land of Egypt. What else does he do?
Gives him a wife.
Gave him Everybody screamed on that. It's he gave him a wife. All right. And what else did he do?
Changed his name.
He changed his name. Man, you guys are good. Now here's the thing. Here's the thing. Is this a good thing? Some of you aren't even sure. You're like, whatever. So here's the thing. Is this a good thing or not? You see, when we read the text and you're like, okay, I'm gonna get my devotionals in. Let me just go ahead and start reading. Oh, this is a great story. All right, great. So if I'm faithful, the Lord shall be with me. Lord, please be with me today and let me be faithful. And we start running out into our day, right? Now, you can do that. That's not necessarily, I'm not saying it's a terrible thing. I'm just saying there's also another picture to look at this story. Is this a good thing? Say that again?
He took away his identity.
Whew. Mercy. Yes, yes. I don't know if you guys are missing this picture here. Now let's take a step back to drop down what he actually said. Joseph is a Hebrew. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Remember I told you we interpret things through the lens of our individual experience? We only look at what's for us? Watch this. God is the God of generations, correct? Yes? Okay. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God has been essentially carrying out this plan for a long time, this plan of salvation. There's this covenant. And inside the covenant, there's a couple key things. God says, hey, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. This is also something he said to Abraham, just throwing you back. Genesis chapter 12, in case you need a reference. But the point is, so he basically tells him of this great covenant. Hey, Abraham, if you follow me, if you do what I'm telling you to do, I'm going to give you a land. Go to the land that I will show you, right? Hey, Abraham, if you follow me, I will be your God, right? And I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, correct? The other aspect is all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. In other words, you're going to have offspring. I'm going to make you a great nation. And out of this nation will come the Messiah. Right? There's a couple key things to this covenant. I just want you to actually start to see this. So God is going to give Abraham a land. He's also going to bless him with children that ends up leading to the Messiah. Right? And he's going to be his God. Now, he does this throughout every generation from Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Now, here's what's interesting. Does the Messiah come down through the line of Joseph? Does the Messiah come down through the line of Joseph? No. So if the story is kind of centered around, like these stories are centering around the patriarchs that have the promise. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then there's this random story of Joseph. Joseph is not the person that has the promise. So why is his story so significant?
Generations.
Yeah, and these are good things. You're like, I don't know. Is there a prophecy? There's something to it. And it's like, what's really the significance of Joseph's story in this if God is trying to show you how he actually is the God of generations? And the story is supposed to be viewed. And think about it like this. When we put on our generational glasses, we have to start to look at this through the lens of generations. The story centers around Adam and his generation. It centers around Noah and his generation, Abraham and his generation, Isaac, Jacob. But Joseph has no part really as far as being a bearer of the promise. So he takes up a large volume of Genesis and we're just like, what? Why? And we're just like, oh, well, it's a great story, you know. Like he did a lot of great things. And if you're faithful, God, you can end up in a position like Joseph. But here's the problem with Joseph's story. God never promised success in Egypt. So Joseph is all of a sudden having success in an area that God never promised. Now remember, think about this as a part of generations. The generational goal is for Joseph to be in the land of his father Jacob, the promised land. He needs to be in the land of Canaan. Correct? That's where the promise is. And in the beginning of the story of Joseph, you find Jacob, who's the patriarch, giving him a robe of colors. He's wearing his father's robe, right? He's taking care of his father's affairs as a Hebrew, a part of the promise. What also ends up taking place is Joseph's name was given to him by Jacob, which has Hebrew meanings, which connects him to the promise. Now, when we start to see that Joseph is now in the land of Egypt, a land that's not promised, he's also wearing a robe that's not the robe of Jacob. He's also now with the wife that's not a Hebrew and doesn't really care about God. In fact, his wife is the daughter of a priest that's a pagan. So when we start to look at Joseph as rising to success, we start to see that he's in the wrong house, he's in the wrong land, he's with the wrong wife, he has the wrong robes, he has the wrong name. And yet we're like, kids, if you're faithful, you can be like Joseph. You can end up in the wrong house, you can end up with the wrong wife, the wrong name, and in the wrong land. And this is all a blessing. Hallelujah.
Like you find into a false prophet.
Right? And so what we have to kind of look at here is when you look at the story of Joseph, you can see the successes as good things if you're measuring it by individual purposes. Oh, wow. God changed his situation. Everything looks good for him right now. What's happening to him? He would have asked, why me, God? But in Joseph's mind, he would have still been wondering, am I still a part of God's promise? And isn't that crazy? Because you're looking at the story and you think it's so successful. Like you can look at so many successful people and like, oh, I want to be like them. But sometimes you can get a lot of success, and in the midst of all that success, feel like you're the most disconnected from God. And you're sitting there now in a story that you deem a success by the world's terms, but it's only because you're not looking at it through generational lenses. It has nothing to do with Egypt. Joseph is a child of Abraham who has the promise of God. Being disconnected from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you were disconnected from the promise of God. It doesn't matter. In fact, if many of you are like, oh, where this guy's getting this? You know, he's just coming up with some random stuff. Let me read you one more thing here. This is actually Genesis chapter 41. And I want you to jump down to verse 50. You can tell because this is actually when Joseph ends up naming his sons. He says, this is Genesis chapter 41 and verse 50, in case you guys are missed that. Okay, it says, and to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. Watch this, he says, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. The first time he names a son, in case you were wondering, well, you're just coming up with this stuff. What's on Joseph's mind? The first time he names a son, he's like, Pharaoh can change my name. Pharaoh can disconnect me, but I'm going to give my child a name that connects them back to the promise. And also reminds that I feel like I'm cut off. Now keep reading. It says also, 52, and the name of the second son he shall call Ephraim. What does this mean? For God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Now, honestly, I'm going to tell you guys, that actually makes no sense. It actually makes no sense at all. And the reason why it doesn't make any sense is because what land is he calling a land of affliction? Say it again? Egypt. The land of my affliction. Wait a minute. I'm sorry. My bad. You're calling Egypt the land of your affliction? You're like, yeah, because remember, like he was like a slave there, and then, you know, like they kept putting him in jail, and things didn't work out for him. I mean, yeah, that's true. But also pay attention to this, that now what we're reading here, this is kind of crazy, because Joseph is now the second in charge. In other words, it would be like your brothers and your sisters or your family. Let's say that you live over in some place in Europe, and they basically completely do away with you, kick you out, and all of a sudden you end up moving over to the United States, right? A bunch of stuff happens here. It's hard here. You go through a lot of trials. You get kicked out of your house. Rent goes, and then you get thrown in jail because you got in a fight with a homeless person. Just life doesn't seem to work out for you. Is the main idea. You see what I'm saying? And all of a sudden, things start to change, and you end up getting a college degree, and you start actually doing some things in politics, and you end up becoming a senator, and after that, you become the vice president of the United States randomly. Let's just put it like that. Now, you're the vice president of the United States after all that difficulty, and you're calling the U.S. the land of your affliction? The place that you got kicked out of was over in Europe. Now think about this in the sense of what happening as far as Joseph. The land where he was afflicted was Canaan. Canaan is the reason why he went to jail and had all these trials in Egypt in the first place. But he doesn't call Canaan the land of his affliction. He calls the land that's now been good to him the land of his affliction. Which goes to show, it's like sometimes you're afflicted because of life circumstances that hit you. And sometimes you're afflicted because you just don't believe that you're in the place that God wants you. The land of Canaan is over here. And anything outside of the land of Canaan is the land of my affliction. This is Joseph's mentality. Now, putting this piece together, are you guys still following? Some people look shell-shocked by that. And honestly, I can't quite see all that well. So again, like following this story here, this story has some major ironic interruptions here. And one of the things that I actually want you to fast forward and see is that Joseph does end up finding out his purpose. He does end up finding out why all these dreams happened to him. I want you to rush over here to Genesis 45, verse 1 through 7. Genesis 45 and verse 1 through 7. So there's a lot of things that end up, again, making us feel back and forth. Why, God, why did this happen to me? We're not always quite sure. But this is a time where Joseph actually becomes sure. This is Genesis chapter 45 and verse 1 through 7. I want to tell you this. I had a friend who, when he was a baby, he specifically ended up having a major illness. And the idea is he was basically about to die. Because there was no help in the hospital, the mother took him over to the witch doctor. Right? So the witch doctor takes the baby, looks at the baby, and is like, okay, starts to figure out what can I go through. He has a giant book. She starts flipping through. He's like, there's nothing here for that. And the mother's like, oh, no. What do I do? I've gone to the hospital. I've gone to the witch doctor. I don't know what else to do. By the way, the mother wasn't Christian or anything. So at this point in time, the witch doctor says, you need to take this baby to the God of heaven. She's like, I don't know the God of heaven or whatever. She ends up going over to some local church and tells the pastor the whole story of what happened. Pastor's freaked out. Like, you went to the what? Right? So basically, he's like, okay, all right, you know what? We're going to go ahead and take the child, and we'll have a special prayer ceremony over the child. The child was turning blue. There's a lot of issues. They thought the child was going to die. During the prayer ceremony, the child receives the color back.
Amen.
And everything starts to be fine with the child. He's totally fine to this very day.
Amen.
One of the crazy things is as he grew up and he was hearing the story of what happened to him, he constantly wondered, why me, God? Why me, God? Like, many other people in that situation had the same illness that I had, and they died. They died. So why am I still here? And it's something that he couldn't quite get to the basis to. But Joseph finally does. And I want you to see how he does this. Genesis chapter 45 and verse 1. Okay? Now Joseph, at this point in time with his brothers, he's revealing himself to his brothers at this point. All right? And he tells his brothers something unique. So let's pick it up. Chapter 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, make everyone go out from me. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, please come near to me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Brothers clearly know that, okay, yeah, this is definitely Joseph, because we never told nobody that story. So verse 5 says, but now, now, by the way, before I get into these last couple verses here, I want you to slow this down and pay attention. Joseph is about to make a purpose statement. I don't want you to miss it. Verse 5, he says, but now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. Watch this. For God sent me before you to
preserve life.
Say that again? Preserve life. For these 2 years, the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. Watch verse 7. And God sent me before you to preserve a prosperity, or some versions say a remnant, for you in the land, and to save your lives by a great deliverance.
Amen.
Now, what in the world is Joseph talking about? What is he talking about? He says that God has sent me before you to do what? In case you missed this purpose statement, he's trying to declare to them the reasons of why these things happened to him. He's also trying to give you some insight into his dream. By the way, do I have a couple volunteers here? Because we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to explain this point, but I'm going to explain it with a little bit of an illustration. So, I need a couple people, probably like 4. Yes, I need like 4 people.
Just to hold them?
Yeah.
So you're gonna... Yep. You rest there.
Hey, how are you? Hey. Good stuff. Good stuff.
How do you want me to be?
I actually spread out a little bit, so maybe 2. So, yeah. All right. Just want to make sure everybody can basically see this. By the way, you guys know it's Super Bowl weekend? No, nobody cares. Okay, well, I'm not going to say I said that anyway. Football's stupid anyway.
That's right.
So, all right. So, by the way, I want you to kind of look at this. Everybody can see football. I know this is going to be a struggle for the camera guy. Everybody can see this football? Yeah? Okay. I don't know if you can all see basically the signs that we're essentially holding up here. But I want to provide the last point to you in a little bit of an illustration, so hopefully it makes some sense to you. So, especially in the game of football, the goal is to score more touchdowns than the other individual. It's a simple phrase with it in case some of you hate football and you like soccer and you think soccer's football. But anyways, so the point is, right? In the context of what we're doing here, I want you to actually look at this and look at this football as the promise of God, right? The promise of God. When we're talking about the promise of God, we're talking about, remember, God is going to make him a great generation. The Messiah is going to come through, right? All these great things are going to happen. God is going to be your God. And at the same time, you'll be blessed. So there's a land, there's God. There's a lot of great things that come out of having the promise of God. But the point is, the main point of the promise of God is that you are the line through which the Messiah comes through. Got it? Got it? Got it. All right. You're the line through which the Messiah comes through. Now, here's the crazy thing. I need another volunteer. Yeah? Go on. Throughout different parts of history and throughout different parts of the book of Genesis, you find individuals carrying the promise. Right? And so the promise is given over to an individual. But life is rough, man. There's a lot of things in life that can hit you super hard. And one of the great things about, we're not going to get violent here, by the way. One of the great things, though, about when it comes to football is that it's a team sport. And you don't do it all by yourself. Come, yeah, you. Come. What's your name? Moses. Who? Moses? 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 Okay, cool. Am I saying that right? Moses?
Moses.
Moses, okay. All right, yeah, Moses. That's a perfect name, man. Come on here. That's what I'm talking about. Man, Moses, okay. All right, so here's the thing. So one of the crazy things about this is that, Moses, come over here. So one of the great things about this is that you end up having the promise. And what's going to end up taking place is as you're going through life, there are many different tragedies, situations that can really hit you and throw you off. And one of the great things about this is that, like in football, many times you have blockers, right? So what ends up taking place is, I want you to come over here. Stand over about right here. Yeah, just right there. And you can take a step down maybe from to this step. So the idea here is you got to get to the other side. But the problem is this. As you're going through the other side, you have to walk by these different concerns and issues. These things can hit you and knock you so hard that you end up falling. And it can completely derail you from the promise of God. Now, these are just a couple illustrations of things. Relationship failure is something we have. Depression, financial ruin, desire for approval. There's a lot of different things that particularly weigh us down. And as we seek to go on this journey in life, what ends up taking place is, as also he comes out, what I want you to do is end up trying to reach for him. All right. So the idea is, let's take a small walk, right? And so he starts coming at you, and you start to get hit with something. Now, this can be overwhelming. He's just like, what in the world is going on? He's like, now this can be overwhelming though to some people, right? And especially when you're trying to actually walk according to what God is calling you to, and you're getting hit with life, like Joseph. He's trying to do the will of God, but life is just happening. And we're like, well, why does his story even exist in the first place? Well, here's the thing. In football, like I said, as he's going through, let's say that you end up coming or walking, and he's coming out at you. You have blockers. And so keep going. As you continue walking, there's another. But sometimes you have blockers. Keep walking. And that's an aggressive one. So you keep going, right? And so these things are jumping out at you, but you have blockers. And the idea is he's still consistently holding the football. He's holding the promise. Now, I want you to actually see this here. Now, you're like, why is it that you're telling me this whole weird random story and making a football illustration? Well, particularly because Joseph says something very interesting. He says, God sent me before you. God sent me before you. Well, what do you mean, Joseph? Because why are you even in the story of Genesis? You shouldn't be there. Now, and not to say that you shouldn't exist. It's just, why do you take up so much of the book of Genesis? He takes up from chapter 37 through 50. I mean, this guy he demands a lot of attention. So it's like, you have to sit there and ask the question, why is someone that's not the patriarch, that doesn't have the promise, taking up so much of the book of Genesis? And it's because Joseph tells you his purpose. He says, because, and you guys are going to come out again. Keep walking. Walk with me. Because he sent me before you, right? To preserve your life. Now listen, Jesus said in this world you will have trouble. So not to say that the block is going to block everything, but you're going to get hit with something. But the idea here is as you kind of see this small illustration, what you find is as Joseph is going through, watch this. If I'm the blocker, who's taking most of the hits?
The block. That's right.
So wait, that means we could hit you harder. It's like, I don't think I calculate that into the message, but that makes sense. So the idea here is you're asking, why me, God? And the sermon is like, well, an answer that you might not have really heard before. You see, if you are a person that preserves life, like Joseph, if you are a blocker, you're going to take most of the hits. So as you go through the story, let's go through again. He's like, man, I'm tired of doing all this. This guy's aggressive. So he might want to play football, actually. Right? The blocker is going to end up taking most of the hits. But see, here's the thing. If you only just look at yourself and you look at your situation, you're like, why is this happening to me? But I told you before, there's two problems. Number one, we ask individualistic questions. But God is not a God of individuals. He's the God of. So you can't understand why something is happening to you by looking at your own experience. It's not possible. Because he's the God of generations. So you would have to expand your thought process to start thinking about not only you, but about others.
Amen.
And so sometimes in life, you go through something. You guys ever wonder why the story of Job is there? You're like, man, this guy's great. Like, he gets everything stripped away from him. Job it's just a hard, rough book. But guess what? Who wrote the book of Job? Moses. I love the name, by the way. I love it. It's like my new favorite guy now. So Moses wrote the book of Job. Now think about this. Moses wrote the book of Job, and he wrote it while he was in exile in the desert. He wrote a story about bad things happening to good people, and they can't understand why. Because Moses was trying to do his best to serve God. He ends up killing a person. That wasn't the best idea. But the point is, he was trying to make the purpose of God happen. And he wasn't sure why things weren't happening. And so he sits out, and as he's there in the midst of this land, and he's like, man, I feel like my purpose in God is just shattered. I messed up. He starts to think about the story of Job. And Job doesn't know why he's going through stuff. But what's interesting is his story, his testimony ends up encouraging Moses while he was in the desert. So Job doesn't understand why it's happening to him, but there's someone in a different generation that's going to need to hear his story to get through their situation.
Amen. Amen.
And so Job ends up going through stuff that if he looked individualistically, why is this happening to me? He doesn't get the answer because it can't be seen in your generation. But there's another generation that's coming, and they will benefit from the things that you've gone through. There are people that have faced the desire for approval and have overcome it. And they're going to write about it so that you can end up having a blocker so you don't fall into the same thing. The same with financial ruin. You guys know people like Dave Ramsey and other stuff. People have gone through different things so that they can be a blocker to you so you don't have to go through them. We got the Mr. Aggressive over here with the depression. That's a serious one, right? The same thing. Relationship failures. People have gone through different things and they're trying to block for you so that you can get to your situation. Now, one of thank you guys, I appreciate this. You guys clear? Illustration? So the thing is, guys, I'm wrapping up here. I appreciate you guys, by the way, helping me out with this. I tried to make an illustration that was less aggressive last time because Tracy was like lifting 100 pounds in my last sermon illustration. So trying to make sure that we're all set and go. Okay, football. Thank you, man. Appreciate it, brother. So that's why Joseph had to go with what he went through. Just so you know, God did leave a remnant in the days of Joseph. His name was Judah. Judah was there when Joseph was speaking. And essentially, Joseph had put them through a test. This is the last point, but I want you to get this. He put them through this test and said very simply, listen, I'm going to actually keep Benjamin, your brother here, because he stole from me. He basically set up this whole transaction that wasn't really true. But the point is, he was actually going to keep Benjamin back, one of the brothers, to stay with him. And Judah knew that to withhold one of the brothers there in Egypt as a slave, his father Jacob would just die. He's like, my father can't handle this. And so he ends up saying, listen, I will give up my life instead of Benjamin. Take me and put me into slavery instead. Let this boy go back home to his father, because it would crush his father to lose his small young boy. And Joseph, at that point, he ends up breaking down. That's what ends up happening in Genesis 44. But why do I tell you this? Because what ends up taking place in the story of Joseph, we don't know who the promise is supposed to be given over to after Jacob. It wasn't Joseph. But all of a sudden, toward the end of the book of Genesis, it's revealed. The person that the promise is supposed to go to is Judah. The person that ended up blocking for Benjamin, so that Benjamin could survive and his life was preserved. That person ends up becoming the person that God is like, yep, that's something I would do. The line of the Messiah will go through Judah. And it's something that Christ did. He blocked for each and every one for us, so that somehow, some way, we could make it to the destination that we're going to. Amen. Now, it's time for us to block for others. Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to go over just a familiar story, but sometimes we just read it through a different lens. We just pray, Lord, that as we are seeking to become more like you, we won't just look at ourselves, but we'll actually look at the broader picture of how you are working in our generation. And not just ask you, why, God, for my situation, but to start to look at the wider picture that sometimes things happen to us and it has nothing to do with us. It's so that someone else can have a blocker, so their life can be preserved. This is our prayer in your name. Amen.
Amen.